Welcome. My name is Jim Conroy. I was at the beginning of IVC some 25 years ago when we got it started. I'll say a word about that a little bit later. So I want to kind of start with a big picture. IVC, Ignatian Volunteer Corps, is really a formation program. I'm utterly convinced it's a formation program for the church of the future. And when I say that, it reflects the transition that's going on in the church. Now, most of you are old enough to have experienced, the Second Vatican Council, and it was just an absolute watershed moment in the church, and it's still the guiding energy, I think, blueprint for the future of the church. It is way underexposed, way underexposed, and I think what we need to do in the future is to really build on that. But if you will, a program like IVC builds on that whole notion that comes out of the Second Vatican Council, that the whole notion of the church as inclusive, the recognition of baptism as the primary gift and key to ministry, the willingness to recognize that a hierarchical way of experiencing church is not sufficient for the needs of the broad community, and that the Second Vatican Council really encourages us to think and reflect and to move with a different spirit. Why do I start with that? So I'm not a real churchy guy, hierarchical church guy. But I was in high school and then college. I went to John Carroll University in Cleveland when documents of the Second Vatican Council were being coming out. And I can remember the different theology professors that we would have. They would come running into the room. You got to read this. And they knew that what was being written and what was being produced within the Second Vatican Council was really earth-moving, and that it was going to have a tremendous effect, on the church, though an uneven and not an immediate effect. In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. One of the really important doctrines was the doctrine to religious community. What was that, Perfectus Caritas? Which said to each religious community, look, you've got to take seriously the documents that are coming out of this council. And you've got to go back to your founder, to your foundress, and you've got to understand the original charism of your community. And with that understanding, you have to adapt that to the circumstances of today. Well, that was a profound effect on the society. So we went from having an understanding of how you do the exercises, to the kind of ministry that would shape our future. For example, and this is before I entered the society. The spiritual exercises were given to novices as a group, and none of you guys are old enough.
Yeah, we did
it. You did it as a group. Well, Ignatius never intended that, especially for people young in formation. No, this is a one-on-one conversation, and many of you are directors of the exercises, and so you need someone who's pretty conversant and understands the dynamics of spiritual movements to help somebody go through and to really make those exercises. The big group approach, well, that did really well for large numbers, but it wasn't adequate. And then the second thing, and that's listening to what's going on in the church. Remember, Vatican II was bringing the church into the 20th century Where were we? 17th century, 18th century, 19th century? Really moving the church forward. It was an intentional effort to modernize the church and to look at the needs of the people of God in a different way, not just to provide, and you don't want to minimize the gift and the beauty of a traditional prayer and liturgy and kind of Father knows best way of proceeding, but it's not sufficient for the future. So I was in philosophy and then theology when the 32nd General Congregation took place for Jesuits, and that was the landslide General Congregation in which Jesuits were really able to affirm, we're kind of getting this whole notion of, the Church of the future, of working with laity, of social justice, and these documents were, again, the Jesuits are right in for philosophy teachers and theology teachers in my theology program. You gotta read this stuff. So the energy that's being developed theoretically in the church about understanding who we are as a people of God and how that is shifting and how that is moving forward was really formative at the core of IVC. Charlie Costello and I, Charlie was my spiritual director for a number of years. He had been president of JSEA, Jesuit Secondary Education Association. Terrific educator. He's the kind of guy that you would want as your principal or he was an English teacher. Just superb teacher. So when the idea of a volunteer corps of IVC came, and I was able to persuade Charlie to join me in trying to make this thing work, and we had persuaded Provincial to give us permission and a little bit of money to get us started. We spent 6 months in a room about the size of these two tables combined and about as deep as this, with literally a card table and two folding chairs, reviewing the documents of the Second Vatican Council, reviewing the documents of General Congregation 3132 of the Society of Jesus, so that we understood theoretically the frame of reference that we were working with. Okay, that we knew that this idea was not coming, from thin air, but was really landed in how the Spirit was moving the church and really moving the Society of Jesus. How did the idea come? Some of you have probably heard this. I was novice director in Warnersville in the Maryland province. It's the best job I ever had. I had that job for 8 years, and we would have Parents' Weekend once a year. It was usually probably about this time of the year. And so Mom and Dad, and if there were other siblings, they would come up to see how, how we were training their son, and were their sons in good care? Were they in good hands? And there was always a talk for the novice master to explain, what is the work of the novitiate. And so I talked about the spiritual exercises and the role of spirituality, and how we were training the men, to pray, to reflect, to search and find the experience of God, and then talking about the kind of work the Jesuits did, and how in a very important way there was a movement towards engaging ever more deeply, because Jesuits had always been engaged in serving the marginalized and the poor, but to be even more explicit about that, so that it had us look at how we do higher education and second education, as well as affecting all of our ministries. And it must have been a good day for me. I must have been particularly eloquent, because one of the dads puts his hands up and he said, Jerry Eck, I'll never forget it. He said, Jim, I hear what you're saying, and I want to pray the way you're teaching my son to pray. I want to have that kind of relationship with Jesus. And then he said, and I want to be involved in works that help other people. What do you have for me? I knew, the minute he asked that question, I knew what my next job was. Now, I had to spend another 4 years finishing my job as novice director. Oh, and by the way, he said, I don't want your vows. And his wife, Maureen, said, well, that's a good thing. So it was born of a very honest, simple question. Men and women, lay men and women, are hungry for a deeper relationship with God. Lay men and women have a desire to help others, or as we often say in IVC, God has been good to me. I want to give something back. How many times have you heard that with your volunteers? God has been good to me. I want to give something back. When we were first starting IVC and we did this interview process for people who were going to be volunteers, I began listening for those exact words. And when I heard them, I knew, well, got to volunteer. It was just almost automatically that clear. So when John the 23rd was elected in 1958, there was no expectation that he was really a hold the fort down kind of pope, because they knew Pacelli, Paul VI was going to be the next pope. I mean, that's the one that they wanted, but they thought he was too young. So they put this old Italian guy in, and he's 350 pounds. He's not going to do anything. You're very wrong. Very wrong. There's photographs of him smoking a cigarette and glass. He's a very normal guy. He's a very ordinary guy. But he was very alert to the movement of the Spirit and very aware of the need for the church to modernize, to begin to deal with the issues that were all around us. Remember that great Italian turn of phrase, aggiornamento. Yeah, you all know it. Aggiornamento. You all know what that means. But in Italian, to update and to modernize the church. Well, that was thrilling and it was threatening. And both at the same time, many people could feel, oh, yeah, God, there's truth in that, there's energy in that, and there are changes that we have to make. And yet other people who are accustomed to power and control and don't want things to change are saying, oh, what? Where are you going with this? You sure this is the Spirit? And how do we move forward? It's always true that you will find, and we know this in spiritual life, that you will find that there is fear and resistance to something that's not familiar. And yet it is often that openness, which requires great courage and great faith to something new, is what's going to move us forward. That's true for us personally, and that's true for us as a faith community. So, and coming back on the plane, or coming here on the plane, I picked up John O'Malley's book, What Happened in Vatican II. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I would ask you to pick it up. I get royalties on his royalties. So it's a brilliant book, and he breaks down what really happened in the Second Vatican Council. And last night I had the chance to sit with John Padberg, who's the greatest. Do you know him?
Yes.
Okay, he was a great historian, and John he's totally with it, and he's just as quick as ever. And we were talking about the energy and the truth of Vatican II, and there were 6 Jesuits there, and to get 6 Jesuits to agree on something easily. But we were all saying, for the timing of the Second Vatican Council and what it overcame and had to deal with is clearly the work of the Holy Spirit. It could not have happened otherwise. It just couldn't have happened otherwise. So there's some critical documents in there, Lumen Gentium, on the people, on the people of God, and the focus on the laity. So it says, yeah, pastors are in charge, and we can deal with that. But a primary responsibility of pastors is to encourage and support and train and enable the movement of the lay community within the church. Okay, so I've got a little bit of both in there. There's some orderliness in this, but pastors have to understand that their principal responsibility is to develop the lay vocation. The primary gift with the Catholic Church is baptism. That's the primary sacrament. It all builds on that, and baptism. And there's so many controversial turns within the Second Vatican Council. Baptism is the notion, is the basis of equality within the church. It's not the sacrament of orders, it's the sacrament of baptism. And that's where we see a lot of the energy going today. And again, the religious, the effective renewal of religious life. So the institutional church as we know it is in massive transition and has been for a while. And within that transition, the hierarchical structure has a role to play, but that role is shifting, and it has to shift. Last week, Pope Francis threw out the notion, which is not a throw-out. He's been thinking about this for a while. The church in a number of places, and he talked, I think, specifically about South America, is the faithful are suffering because there are just not priests. What was it? The Amazon. There are just no priests. He thinks that a married clergy would help respond to that circumstance. He's articulating what a lot of us sense. If a faith community requires a priestly minister for sacramental ministry, we're starving ourselves by not having enough priests and by not having good priests. And he's saying there is a solution to it, and that may not be the only solution, but there's a solution to it. So while the institutional church is really struggling in some ways, the church as community, as people of God, is blossoming. Okay, it's really kind of booming, and I would point to things like IVC, JVC, in which people are engaged in service, in prayer and reflection, and ultimately, I would say, are being formed for leadership. And that's the key piece that I want to keep focusing on, formed for leadership. So just a couple, and the documents keep coming from the Society of Jesus, and frankly from this Holy Father. At General Congregation 35 for the Jesuits, Benedict XVI affirms Jesuit mission and ministry, and he says, the church needs you. We must in turn look to our collaborators in mission and say, with gratitude and affection, that the call we have received is a call that is shared by us together, okay? So just think about that. And Benedict was a marvelous traditional pope with deep historical understanding of the role of the church. And I think he's probably one of the most courageous popes we've ever had. His act of stepping down is this huge expression of faith and hope for the future. I think it's extraordinary what he did. The church needs you. So he's saying that to Jesuits, and then the society is saying to collaborators, the church needs you. And we, you and I are formators in that spirit to help people to come to the notion of the church really needing you and people our age are, we may be slow to hear that, but I'm convinced that those who are leading, who are hearing that, are providing leadership. Now, we can look at, old people being leaders. I retired. I've given up that mold. That's not what I do anymore. That's not what God had in mind. A third generation, you live 25 years longer, you're healthy, you have resources, you have skills, and you have a desire to feed and to help establish something for the future. What do you think God's doing? Okay? What do you think God's doing? This is a resource. This is a huge, enormous resource, and we're beginning to get it, and we're beginning to work with it. So the skills of a lifetime and a lifetime worth of mature learning experience. You know what that is? That's invaluable. You put that together, that's leadership. And the example, and it's often a quiet example, the example of IVC volunteers is well beyond what they think or what we even see. So that's kind of the framework that I want you to have in mind as you're doing this thing. So an IVC reflector is a man or woman who is skilled as a spiritual director, who has training as a spiritual director, and who also has experience in ministry of some sort, which has required you to think not only in the I-thou sense of God, but the experience of God within everything that goes on within our daily life and our interactions with people. So when you think as someone who's trained as a spiritual director, how is spiritual direction different than the work of someone who's a spiritual reflector? I think the difference are just a couple things. One, you are listening to a person's experience in a way that looks for and helps them to identify how the experience of God is, which is what we do in spiritual direction. And what are our resources? Well, it's our training, it's the masters, it's our own ongoing integration of how we listen and how the Spirit moves within us. It's that we use to help others. I think, though, with a reflector, you can do a couple other things that you can't do with in regular spiritual direction. I think you can be a little bit more direct as a spiritual reflector. That is to say, if you have people who are working, in hard situations, working with someone who's recovering from addiction, or someone who's been recovering from an abusive situation, you can help the volunteer by helping them to connect with other resources. Not just a spiritual reflection, but people counseling skills, people with professional skills. Don't be afraid to draw in the larger community. In spiritual reflection, we might not be so direct or active with them. This has to be larger. I think we're willing to be a little bit larger. So I think that's one difference. So you listen with the ear and the heart of a spiritual director, sensing where the movement is, but you also have the resources of the community that you can help a person to understand and maybe integrate their experience a little bit more fully. I think a second thing is to help them connect, and I don't know how many of you go to the monthly meetings, but help them connect to what's going on in a larger context. Okay, now in spiritual direction, you're very, very careful about what you say. Okay, and you still have to have that in awareness, but it's true. People come to IVC with a whole range of backgrounds and experiences and biases. We all have certain biases. And while you have to be careful about political and religious sensitivities, you can also speak to some of them. You know, is there a justice issue about what's going on in immigration? I think you can speak to them. And I think you can provide resources that would help. You know, it's not just that you're dealing with somebody who's dealing with a refugee, but there's some, what is the church teaching right now about the immigration issues? I mean, there's some pretty significant stuff that's out there. So I think you can go on beyond some of the barriers that you would kind of hold yourself to within the realm of spiritual directors. You know, the conservative, progressive, I don't know, Republican, Democrat. Occasionally, is there a moment when you might want to push that question a little bit more as someone who is a reflector? I think so. I can't tell you what it is. But some of the barriers, some of the discipline that you would have, I think in this circumstance requires that we be a little bit more prophetic. You know, this church was built on a vision of truth and compassion and love. So I think we can be a little bit more direct with people, and you're gonna, you know, all the issues that are coming out. You know, I'm afraid of working with people who have been in, you know, who have been in prison, or to go down into a ghetto. There's a guy. This was early on in the experience of IVC when we were setting it up. He was a wonderful man. He was a head of counseling for a public school system, and you know, significant job. And he was volunteering in a very, very poor part of Baltimore. You remember the story, The Wire? You know, it was on TV. It was kind of, you know, that situation. And so he was willing to do the job, but he was also going to be careful. And so he got one of those small spray bottles of mace. So he's getting out of the car. He's going, you know, into this volunteer place for the first time, and he looks at it. I got to make sure I know how to use it. And of course. So you're going to have to help people to overcome some of their, you know, the fears. I mean, it's rational, but it's also irrational. You know, the guy who, you speed through, you know, the bad parts of town, and you cross the street when, you know, the wrong people are coming down. You know, it's all that stuff. But help people to think about that, because it's true. You know, God doesn't come to us in thunderbolts. God comes to us in ordinary things. You know, how do I do this? How do I respond to that? And so the more practical the experience, the more real it is. And, you know, they're not having a mystical experience. They're having, you know, how do I deal with this guy who hasn't washed in 3 days? Okay? So I think you could be much more, direct with people who are volunteers. I think it's critical, and we were talking about this morning with volunteers. You've got to help people capture their experience. You know, encourage them to keep a journal. I pulled out my cell phone because I've started doing this myself. I'm a good journal person when I have time, but often I don't have time. You know, I've got 3 messages. 4 messages. So I'm not an addict, but I'll go to the cell phone after I've had something that's captured my attention. And there's a microphone, and there's also, you're better at it. You've done this more than I have.
I just told Mike, the guy I'm working with, to do it that way.
Yeah, that's it.
You don't have to really write it down. Just get it out.
Get it out. You got to help them get it out. And if this helps, you know, press the mic, or the app, I do the notes thing, and I just need a word or two and a feeling or two. And then I got it, and then I can come back to it. So, number one, you got to help them capture their experience. And be very pragmatic about that, too. Whatever works for them. Whatever works for them. Two, in the one-on-one sessions, you're going to have, and you'll have this all the time, you're going to have people who will say, well, God really doesn't really come to me or really talk to me, and in truth, why would he? I mean, I'm not really worthy. He'll talk to sister. God will spend time with you, but not with me. So you're going to have a lot of people who are totally unfamiliar with conversation on a spiritual level. That's reflective of their God experience. And you have to be able to persuade them that their ordinary experience of what's going on in their life is shot full of God. When we read documents and we hear lectures, and encourage, we can give good talks about the poor, but when we can name the poor, when we know them face to face, that's the transitional moment. It is important that as reflectors, because you're dealing with a level of the more raw conversation that's really formative, helping them and for us to know what our issues are, and to know, I feel this, when to come in strong and when to pull back. But I say to you, you have a critical role in that. And I think your voice and your timing, when to be patient, when to be more direct, I think that's all really critical to help people who are being formed in the church. Okay, we're building the future. I mean, even on old people, we're building the future because they are modeling it. Okay, so I think among yourselves, you might want to think about that question of, how do we support one another? When I'm in the role of a spiritual director or reflector, the kind of conversations we're having today, I'm aware that I have the front row seat to the best show in town. Okay? We have that privileged moment, sitting with a man or a woman who really seeks to grow closer to God, and they're having these magnificent experiences. And if faith and the beauty of faith being expressed and articulated, and often in very unsophisticated but yet profound ways. Thank you for your care of IVC volunteers. You're formators, if you will. You're helping form, a very lively, conscientious, generous group of people. And so you too are generous.